My name is Katie Rogers, and I am here wearing two hats. I am the programs director here at the Daedalus Foundation and also the president of the Catalogue Raisonné Scholars Association. So it is both my pleasure to welcome you as the host institution, but also as the organization from which this panel came from. So the Daedalus Foundation, for those of you who don't know, and I know many of you have heard me say this before, was founded by the abstract expressionist Robert Motherwell. Motherwell passed away in 1991 and left us with a broad mission statement to further the understanding of modern art and modernist principles. And we honor Motherwell's legacy by creating a space for dialogue across our discipline with art historians and artists and curators. There are more seats towards the front for anyone who's coming in. So this evening came out of some conversations with Charles Stuckey. Charles and I have been in conversation a number of times about a variety of topics, but over the course of this year, we've had a lot of conversations about what you do in a catalogue raisonné when you're not sure about the work. So a catalogue raisonné is, of course, meant to be a definitive or at least comprehensive publication, depending on how you look at it. And it is meant to be a resource both for scholarship and the market, and it's relied upon by a variety of people. So there's a lot of pressure to make sure that everything that goes in is accurate. But as Charles and I discussed, there are occasionally times, with most projects, not every, where you're not sure about a work. And you've gone through every process that you possibly can, and you're still not sure. And so tonight's conversation is about that. What do you do with that? So what we'll do is I'll pass this over to Charles, and we won't do short bios. There are sheets on your chairs where you can read more about our illustrious panel. The panel will discuss for a while, and then we'll have some Q&A. Please wait for the microphone for the Q&A. Otherwise, afterwards, we'll have a reception. Thank you very much. Charles?
I go here. Speak within 6 inches of the mic. I hope you can hear. First of all, thank you all for coming to this panel. I want to be very brief and take as much advantage of the panelists as possible. But let me start by pointing out sort of the obvious. What is a maybe? And what we're talking about is a work of art associated with an artist that either is uncharacteristic in some way or is not fully documented. And so as a result of one or the other, there remains some level of doubt about whether you can say with certainty that it belongs in the corpus. And it comes to me to sort of raise this question because of my role as the head of research for the Catalogue Raisonné on a 20th century artist, Yves Tanguy, where you would think there'd be plenty of documentation, but there isn't. And this catalog was undertaken with the best intentions, following the most scientific procedures, starting around the year 2000, when it was decided that there should be a supplement to the original catalog of Tanguy's works made in the 1950s by his widow, Kay Sage, and published in 1963 by his dealer, the Pierre Matisse Gallery. Following on the very good precedent of the Rembrandt Committee, where I think everyone agreed that for a reference work like a Catalogue Raisonné, it was important to have a variety of voices rather than a single author who would be, perhaps trapped by kind of idiosyncratic taste and opinions. And so they created a committee. I was not part of it at the beginning, of 4 specialists, and that committee met for 20 years and reviewed all of the works that they could. Of course, some of them we no longer know their whereabouts and never have yet seen them, but the committee went through everything, and it was my job as head of research to try to find out everything that we possibly could about the works so that the decisions could be made in that context. Nevertheless, when we closed the book on the committee, roughly 10% of the works that we had discussed, it turned out that the committee was divided 50-50. And that is why we're here tonight, is that we're wondering, under those circumstances, we got there doing the right thing, what is the etiquette? What is the right way to go about either the publication of these works or the publication of any of our remaining questions about them? What is the right thing to do in a situation of that sort? Elizabeth?
Thank you, Charlie. So thank you, everyone at the CRSA, for coming tonight. And thank you, Charlie, for including me in this panel. When Charlie called me to talk about the idea of maybes, it was with great interest to me because the organization that I run, the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, we're doing several catalogue raisonnés. And much to the dissatisfaction of a lot of the people who approach us for opinions, sometimes we come back to them with a maybe or a pending, which is very frustrating to people who want a definitive answer. We find that in the marketplace, people like definites. They like to pin the responsibility on someone, so they want a yes or a no. But with scholars feel a responsibility to be more cautious and oftentimes aren't willing to be so definitive in absence of the fact. So this panel and this discussion is really an opportunity for all of us from different sectors of the art world, from the market, from the museum world, from scholarship, from conservation, to really reach some type of a consensus, if possible, on what we do, because currently we're at an impasse. Very few people who own works of art that are considered maybes want necessarily to immortalize their work as doubtful, possibly doubtful. But is that really the case today? Could it be framed in another way? So the way that we've organized this panel tonight, Charlie and I both have a number of questions, and I'm sure all of you do too. And we're going to start off taking turns asking these questions, hopefully covering some of yours. But we're really here to clear the air and have a discussion from a variety of points on what we should do and is there some consensus. So if I may, I'm going to begin, and I'm going to begin with a question directed toward Jim, our conservator here, but certainly I would love the other panelists to chime in. And my question for Jim is something that Charlie and I really spoke about at the beginning. Forensic science seems to be considered the magic bullet for solving all of our problems by some. It's like the DNA evidence in a court hearing. Everyone wants to know if someone has cast doubt on their painting. Well, have you had it analyzed? We're wondering, sparing you the 50 questions we could ask about this, we're wondering, is that really true? Is there going to be a point in time when forensic science is going to be that magic bullet, or is it too heavy-handed to take that approach?
I would say, yeah, it's pretty heavy-handed, and the answer to the question specifically is no. Forensic science does not answer these questions. It's a pedestrian observation, but what it does is it tells you what it is not. I mean, that's where it gets definitive, where they're anachronistic materials. If the materials are completely of the time that is in question, it just says they are of the time. It doesn't tell you by whom, unless there is something so unbelievably idiosyncratic about the materials that it might be regarded as a signature. But, and even that, I think, would be, weak beer for an attribution. You would need a whole lot of other evidence to back that idiosyncratic material up.
Can I ask a question? Forgive me for interrupting, but I'd love to ask you a question.
Yeah.
There was a report recently that a painting by Rembrandt had shown his fingerprints on it, and I was wondering whether that was anything that you have seen before.
His fingerprints.
His fingerprints on a painting.
Yeah.
How they know it was his, I don't know.
Right. I would refer you to a great New Yorker article some number of years ago. I think it was by David Grant, about a man who claimed to be able to do this kind of authentication through fingerprints. And it got really complicated, and it became clear that it's a pretty spurious way to go about this kind of business. So,
Sort of what I thought.
yeah,
Yes, he's a Canadian guy.
yeah, Peter Paul Bira. Yeah.
You have not fingerprinted all of the Cezannes, David, I assume? We haven't fingerprinted Tanguys at all.
Well, I dusted them all, but we didn't show any, we didn't see any fingerprints.
Yeah. But that issue that you're talking about of the work coming up for sale, where the discovery of a fingerprint under the layer of varnish was somehow used to suggest that would overcome any maybe that anyone might have, is exactly what this evening should be about. My questions are really just to anyone. What sort of etiquette? You've probably had more experience than anyone delivering news that people aren't thrilled to hear, Vivian. I mean, what do you find is the best way to break the news to someone that either you're not interested in the work, or you're at a point where you don't know what to say?
Well, actually, for the Kandinsky Catalogue Raisonné, there was a committee, and we always examined works of art and compared them to similar works that were either in the Centre Georges Pompidou, given by Nina Kandinsky, or in Munich, that were given by Gabriela Minter. So we had really pure sources against which we compared works. There were certainly maybes. However, we decided that we would only include works, and so our letter to people who had signed a release of indemnity was whether the work would be included or would not be included in a scholarly book. However, there were works where it was really too hard to know, and I would tell people we need to do further research. I mean, I think that John Rewald was always very articulate on this subject, saying that you don't go into someone's home and look at the painting over the fireplace and gag and tell them it's a fake. You say you really should have somebody do research on this. And certainly we had. So we would do research, and not always was there an answer. So we gave, and we didn't give reasons, and we didn't give, for many works, we would just say, it requires further study, and left it at that. And so far, all those maybes are still maybes, and most of them have really disappeared. In some cases, we would ask that they had studies done of works of art, so that certainly Jim and his colleagues occupy a very essential role. But no, we didn't. I was not the messenger to shoot, because we didn't. Very often we would defer any decisions.
But I mean, you must have reached a point where you had certain things that you said this is going into the catalog, and certain things that this is going out of the catalog.
Yes.
Which pile was the maybes in?
The maybes, at the beginning there were lots of maybes. There still are maybes, because very often, if it's not been possible to examine the work of art, if you can't look at it, well, then you're not going to decide.
Right.
Certainly there were works that were problematic if you were just looking at them from a connoisseurship point of view. But then over a period of time, very often I would find evidence that was conclusive, and then it was yes, they were in the Catalogue Raisonné.
But you kept them pending and out of the catalog until you were absolutely
Yes.
sure.
If in doubt, leave it out.
If in doubt, leave it out. So that's where you go with
That's
that's where you go
essentially,
with maybe.
yes, I mean, to go right to the end of the chase, yes, that's my point of view. Obviously, there were many maybes at the beginning, and over a period of time, over, I don't know, 25 years or something like that, it was possible in many cases to make a definitive decision that the work was by Kandinsky, and yes, then it's in the Catalogue Raisonné. And, it was really fun finding all the evidence that proved that works were right, and it came from various sources, some archival, some technical, and much of it serendipity.
Vivian, I have a question stemming from that. The leave it out, take it out, or if in doubt, leave it out. I definitely understand the caution that backs that reasoning, given the world we live in with lawsuits. I'm wondering, though, as a scholar in the digital age, when people are used to information sharing, and we're now in the climate where people expect to know, they want to know, do you think that scholars and curators, frankly, and I'd love for both you and Stephanie to address this, do you have an obligation to raise those maybes in a public forum so that the debate can be had? And if setting up an exhibition, would you consider including a maybe to have that discussion?
I think that a lot of the discussion about maybes takes place with the committee. And not just that the committee is a finite number of people, 5 in our case, but then you can invite other people to join in the discussion depending upon the work of art, whether it's a drawing or a painting, and include points of view of people who knew the artist, not in the case of Kandinsky, unfortunately, but certainly involving conservators and people who are experts on technical issues. And so that there certainly was a conversation, but I think that it's very hard to do this certainly in social media.
Yeah, right.
Because the water gets very muddied. I tend to think that a catalogue raisonné really should, or how I think of it, is this is a book, a publication, or a database of works that are by the artist, so that they definitely are by this artist and thus are a benchmark against which other works can be compared.
Mm-hmm. Do you have an opinion about that in terms of your exhibition planning, Stephanie?
Well, I'd say I've had lots of experiences with maybes in permanent collection installations and caring for collections. But as far as exhibitions go, I think the experience that I have the best is most of the exhibitions that I've done take a long time, unfortunately, and there's a lot of research, and I often have conservation as a part of the work that I do, research, x-rays, as Jim well knows when we worked on TEAS together. And so if I come to something, I come to it from my research, not sort of like, oh, here's a picture, I wonder if it would be good in the show, and checking the other way. So recently I did a show of an artist named Tarsila Duamaral, who only 2 years before we started to work on the show had her first Catalogue Raisonné. And it's kind of an interesting project. If you can find the actual catalog online, it might be interesting to see, because it's a whole new field in Brazil to do a Catalogue Raisonné, and Tarsila is as popular as Picasso. So it's a lot of work that was sold at various times. The work itself, this is an artist who repeated things many times in her career, so there's all kinds of value issues with that. And there was a work that, from my research, I saw as a developmental stage of a painting that she made. I realized as I looked in the Catalogue Raisonné, and it's an interesting Catalogue Raisonné, they publish piles of things that they don't know the status of, but they published them anyway. And one of the works there was the one that I wanted to include. As it happened, it wasn't something that we had the space to include in the show, or I might have in that case, because it felt like there was a lot we were sort of bringing to light about this artist. But as it was, I certainly wrote about it in the catalog and put it in the context of the work I was doing, and recognized it, because it may have been, because this artist has only had one sort of story written about her, that I actually uncovered something that would help the committee later on reevaluate that work. But I didn't contact the committee, and I mean, talk to a couple of them, but I didn't, bring it up for reconsideration or something like that. But I tend to come at things that might be in shows from the research first, so it's harder for me I'm always telling a story, so harder to answer your question, I think.
David, when you were accepting or rejecting works for sale. What were your guidelines?
You mean when I was at Sotheby's?
Yes.
The guidelines kept changing. I think there was, at the beginning of my career at Sotheby's, there was far less expertise available than at the end of my career there. There were hardly any catalogue raisonnés. The guideline really was that you made up your own mind. The expert made up his own mind based on whatever information he could get. And then that changed when Sotheby's and Christie's took on the responsibility of guaranteeing the authenticity. Then it became a whole different problem, because how do you guarantee authenticity? Well, we really stood on the shoulders of the people who were the experts in the field. So even if we thought that something was genuine, for instance a Modigliani, and it wasn't in Chironi, Sotheby's wouldn't sell it. Even if we thought it was genuine, even if it looked genuine, even if the provenance and all the rest of it led one to a positive feeling about it, if you couldn't legally guarantee that it was genuine, you couldn't sell it. By the time I left Sotheby's, which was 20 years ago, the system had become much tighter, because there were many more catalogue raisonnés, there were many more authorities who hadn't yet written catalogue raisonnés. There were many more catalogue raisonnés in production, and there were also it had given us the opportunity to review how accurate and authentic some of the catalogue raisonnés actually were.
How so?
A lot of catalogue raisonnés have dubious pictures in them, even fakes, I would say. How they got there, different reasons, but I don't think there are hardly any of them that are actually perfect. I think Kandinsky is one of them.
Yes, we all do.
No, it's not perfect, but
Yes, it is.
No, one always learns more, and I think that one has to consider a catalogue raisonné as a scholarly project, where you do research and you involve many people, and so it's a wide net that you cast, but then in the end, you have to just come to terms with what you've found and include that, and then yes, you may learn more later on.
Yeah.
And also, we're all human. We can all make mistakes, and we can also all be told things that aren't true. And I think that certainly the subject of provenance, which I'm sure you will want to get into later, is one where it's very, very easy to fake a provenance. And there were pictures attributed to Kandinsky, where the committee would say, that we had decided de ne pas inclure l'œuvre que vous avez soumise à l'examen. And then the person would come back to me and say, yes, but it has a new provenance now. Maybe you would want to reconsider it. Which I always liked.
Charlie, if Vivian, I think, opens up a very interesting line of inquiry here when she says it's a scholarly activity. And you've spoken of the etiquette of sort of how do you approach the owner of a work.
Yeah.
But, I'd like to get into the etiquette of the scholarship and the kind of what I would call the ethics of it as well. Because, everything is an authentic something. And when that's not funny, that's true. And so, and it's an interesting authentic something if it has, veered into the orbit of a catalogue raisonné. So when Vivian says, if in doubt, leave it out, haven't we failed scholarship in those instances if that somehow doesn't become public?
Well, what you do is you keep doing an addendum, and so you keep continuing. The addenda get smaller and smaller as the decades go by, but that, I didn't mean that there's one finite moment and then, chop, that's the end, and everything else isn't right. I mean, the latest Kandinsky addendum is this big. You can see how thick it is compared to the 500-600-page tomes that preceded it. But there's always a need to keep adding, to have an addendum. And if you're doing a Catalogue Raisonné online, that's of course much easier to publish. But I think that one has to make a decision at some point as to what is in a Catalogue Raisonné.
Sure.
One of the things that strikes me about maybe the uncomfortability people have with publishing or a maybe list is that the Catalogue Raisonné historically is surrounded by this mythology of incontestable authority. And to admit uncertainty maybe chips away at that authority, as does digital publication. It's been argued that if you publish a Catalogue Raisonné online, some might feel that it's less authoritative because it can change over time. And I'm wondering if, in the age of digital publication, there is room to have a devoted section that is constantly updated and left, where these works are identified as such. And it also invites people who are speculative in terms of market investment to identify things that someday might have a market value. Is there an opportunity for that? Do you think as authors of a Catalogue Raisonné, would you be open to doing something like that? David, if you'd like to.
It's a very interesting question that you raise. We have in the Catalogue Raisonné of Cézanne, the online Catalogue Raisonné of Cézanne, which I've been working on with my two colleagues, Walter Feichenfeld and Jane Warman. We had the benefit of two previous Catalogue Raisonnés, which were very well done. One by Leonello Venturi in 1939, and then the one by John Rewald in 1994, whatever it was, 6. So we were really working with a very, very well-researched body of work. Obviously, Rewald had some disagreements with Venturi, and we have had some disagreements with Rewald. Disagreements of opinion, I mean. One of the ways that we dealt with this was Walter Feichenfeld's idea, was to devise a category called traditionally attributed. We figured that works that had been attributed by Leonello Venturi or by Rewald himself, these were attributions, which had to be taken seriously. If we disagreed with the attribution, we would say traditionally attributed. And we have used this designation not just to include pictures which we don't think are genuine. If we're completely convinced that the work is not by Cézanne, it is left out altogether. If we're not certain, and there aren't very many that fall into the uncertain category, then they get a traditionally attributed designation. And then the third group of works which go into the traditionally attributed category are works that we haven't seen. I mean, many works have disappeared. And they haven't disappeared, but we don't know where they are. So if we haven't seen them, we haven't all three seen these works, they also go into the traditionally attributed category. It's quite likely that one day we will come across these and see them and remove the traditionally attributed designation. But that's how we have dealt with the maybes. With regard to publishing, all the works that have been submitted to us in one way or another as Cézanne's, I can't imagine a book big enough to. Once a week we get requests to look at a painting that some old lady found in an antique shop in Aix-en-Provence. And is definitely a Cézanne because his great-grandson's best friend said so. There are all degrees of dubious pictures, which some are really convincing. Some are absolutely ridiculous.
So those are, I mean, the ridiculous ones, they're more of a no than a maybe. But I wonder, is there a case for publishing something that is a maybe today? I mean, one might argue that it at least keeps the conversation going and that picture isn't forgotten about. People, any press can be good press, perhaps. And I'm wondering what you all think in terms of the appetite today for not only art historians, but also owners of paintings to put their works out there and agree to publish these works as maybes.
May I jump in? I think that from my perspective, I feel like it's, there's the market issue, and maybe if we just put parentheses around that for a moment, Catalogue Raisonné is a scholarly enterprise, and it reflects deep knowledge and research, and that means honesty. And I think the drive for certainty makes it hard to put those maybes someplace. But I think that if we're honest about the scholarship and the research, then it makes sense to publish works that are to be researched. And potentially, Vivian, when you started the Catalogue Raisonné for Kandinsky, it wasn't a possibility to do digital publishing.
No.
But
Nor did the French want to do it at all, even in more recent years. I mean, because the Société Kandinsky is a legal entity, or was, because it no longer exists, in France, so that there was a very strong wish not to.
And I realize everything I say, there's an example of why
Yeah.
that couldn't work. But in the case of my experience with the Tarsila
Yes.
work, having things that they're not listed as maybe, they say more research needed.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a burgeoning field. It almost feels dishonest for the enterprise of a Catalogue Raisonné to not recognize that not all research can be done right away. And to be honest about the research seems to me, if we were all writing papers, we'd be very honest in our footnotes about the state of our thinking. Why wouldn't a Catalogue Raisonné do that as well? I realize there's like a million reasons why
Yeah.
not, but just if you would just think about it as the scholarly work that includes, may be that there's still more research needed on some things.
Oh, yes.
So to leave them out is a decision.
But maybe for some of the works where you are doing research and you do have various arguments, then you could publish an article about it, and so that it doesn't have to be just say nothing or in a Catalogue Raisonné. There are also other ways in which one can discuss works, and certainly and I think that there couldn't be exhibitions where you have two different paintings, both perhaps of the same subject, perhaps by Caravaggio, as we read about recently, and you put them side by side, and then everybody can go and look at them, and the experts and can actually see the works, because I think you have to examine everything. You can't just be in the library doing research, but if you have an open forum at the time of an exhibition or afterwards, then you can publish the proceeds of it.
I wonder whether, David, what you mentioned, the shift when the auction houses began to guarantee authenticity, is in any way loosely connected with then the rise in what was expected from the Catalogue Raisonné, whether that didn't inadvertently sort of shift a kind of responsibility onto these scholarly books, which they were never prepared to have. Being fallible and inconclusive. But it seems to me that, on my bookshelf, some of the Catalogue Raisonnés that were published in the 1970s or the 1960s, it wasn't so unusual to have a section of, these are maybe not by El Greco, but by a studio, or these need more study. But it seems to me that in the last 20 or 25 years, that one's much more reluctant to. It's a much more delicate subject now than it once was.
Well, I think the demand from buyers has pushed up that barrier. Buyers, whether they're at auction or privately or whatever, buyers want to be sure that what they have bought is authentic and that they can therefore resell it.
Of course. But they also want someone to blame if it turns out that it's not.
That happens a lot
Right.
too.
I mean,
Yes.
and so the decision
Yes.
to guarantee works is a decision to accept that blame.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Because you can transfer it somewhere else.
when I first started at Sotheby's, most of the experts were in Paris. They were usually family members, Nina Kandinsky and Isabelle Rouault and people like that. And if you wanted to get an expert opinion, you were supposed to send the work to the experts who had been nominated by the French courts, which was a wonderful idea, except that also in the law it allowed the expert, if they thought the work was not authentic, to destroy it. So we couldn't get very many consignors actually to agree. But it was a pretty efficient system. I think it still exists. I think
Yeah, I think it does.
Yes, the droit moral
I'm
still
sure- I'm
exists.
sure that it
Oh,
does.
yes, it does.
Well, that definitely raises the question. It might be a bit off topic, well, maybe not. The droit moral. It's interesting. In response to this panel that we staged here, it seems as if this is a discussion that we can really only have in America. We couldn't really have this as productive a discussion. Maybe I'm wrong. In France, because of the droit moral, there's no question who the expert is, and what they say goes, and that's the end of it. And it strikes me as, maybe being a safer space when there is someone like an artist heir who is designated to make those decisions for the marketplace, but it seems to be a disservice to scholarship. So I'm just wondering, with the question of maybes and these works being so important, is there a call to charge to destroy the droit moral for the sake of the artist's legacy? Do we feel that these maybes are important in that regard? Probably not, but.
didn't quite get your question.
Oh, my question is the droit moral valid? Or how does the droit moral deal with these maybes?
Well, I say the droit moral has been very effective but it is subject to weakness and subject to abuse.
Oh, yes.
And I think that in the first half of the 20th century, I think it was really a very useful, a very useful law, because you did get definitive answers, and it was clear who the authorized expert was. They may not always have been the right answers, but it was definitive. Especially if they tear up your Rouault, I think the rise in expertise has also, worldwide, has sort of also been balanced by the decline of the prestige of French experts.
But also, very often the family members are, they're not professionally qualified to tell. and they are not art historians, and they're not researchers, and even very often the widows or whoever has the droit moral never knew the artist at that period of time. So I'm, from my point of view, which is of course very American, I find great problems with that system where it's really a family member or somebody designated, and they have no idea, and the reasons why they give the certificates, sometimes you don't even want to know the reasons why why they were persuaded to call work authentic.
It was also a temptation for some of these widows to make
Make
their own
money.
works and add them into the Catalogue Raisonné.
Yes.
I think that we
Or to make money
both.
without being gifted enough to make a léger or something.
Jim, I'd like to get back to your point about scholarship and the ethics of withholding information. And we find ourselves in a situation where we're very sensitive to what I would call a red flag, something that you're looking over the entire picture that you have, all the information at your fingertips. A lot of it checks out, but there's something that remains problematic. And so it's clear to every hurdle. It seems to me somehow irresponsible to keep that to myself. But on the other hand, I realize if it is published, it creates problems of its own sort. But it does take away from my fellow scholars the chance to sort of pick up any given subject where one might have left off with it.
Can we not in some way regard the Catalogue Raisonné as a large hypothesis that is in the process of being tested all the time? Mm-hmm. And so therefore, that is just part of the hypothesis and the testing of the paradigm around this one artist, and more generally, Catalogues Raisonné.
I'm all for that. I mean, I think that's what we need to do, and and it seems to me that the more information, well, just in Cezanne, for example, your category of traditionally attributed is a big help to let the reader know whether or not this is a conclusion that the authors of the catalog have reached, or simply something that is pending. And previously, I mean, that's seldom, if ever, the case, that the cataloger will tell you whether they reached their decision by actually examining in the work, or whether someone sent them a black and white photograph and they signed on the back that it was okay. I mean, what were the terms under which the original connection with the artist might have been made are more often than not lost to us. And so even though it doesn't seem as if we're starting from scratch, in many cases, that's what we're doing. And I think that's where Jim's concern about the ethics to the scholarly field rather than the market are very important to consider.
And I have one other question, and maybe then we can open it up to the floor, or you can, any of our panelists can raise a question. With regard to, Stephanie, you had said put the market in parentheses. I don't know if you can ever do that in this discussion, because for better or for worse, the market has so much influence on this question. And I mean, even now we're seeing that the market is bypassing scholarship and going directly to forensics. And I'm just wondering, is there some type of reconciliation that can be made? In popular culture, you would think, okay, science is going to solve it all. As Jim said, it's not going to be solved. But where is the balance to all of this? Is there a balance? Can scholars and the market work without, everybody has an agenda, but is there some way that there can be some type of consensus for the good of the artist's legacy, or is that too naive to think? Any of you have thoughts on that?
Well, just to let the cynic come out in me, but I'm told that markets are efficient and that they process all of the information and come up with a determination.
I think that, in my mind, there's a disconnect between certainty and lack of certainty. And certainty relates to the market. It's a drive for the market. And the lack of certainty or the need for more openness relates more to the enterprise of scholarship involved in a Catalogue Raisonné. And I don't know how, I don't know how to reconcile those. It feels like, yeah, I have no answer for that at all. Hope
Well, maybe
somebody else
someone
does.
in the audience has an answer to that. I think it'd be fun to open it up to any of you that has questions on the subject for any of us. Or David. Oh, I think you have to get a microphone. That's what we were told at the beginning.
Thank you. Well, is this on?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. So, being someone in the marketplace, there's this very difficult role as an intermediary with clients who had an artwork that was previously in Catalogue Raisonnés or previously accepted. And if they're just outright rejected, that's sort of easy to work with the client. Not easy, but relatively. But if they're demoted to maybes, or if the habit of the committee is just to say, we will not include it, but give no other questions, then you're left with trying to explain to someone who asks you, well, do I throw it out? How do I insure it? Do I keep this piece? And it's just a very hard thing to address. I don't know if, I'm not asking for an answer to it, but I just, as a topic, it's very hard to advise somebody.
It's very
About the
painful to
work.
be in purgatory.
Yeah.
And I know people who have been for decades, back and forth and unable to reach a determination about, something in their family and whether they're able to monetize it or not. And it's just that discomfort that we're trying to overcome,
Just a small follow-up. So if the habit is to simply say we're not including it, but the committee actually completely rejects it, but for liability reasons won't ever actually say that in some instances, then it does leave the owner in a very difficult position to even determine what to do with the piece, insure it, things like that.
We had some discussion about, should we invite the owner? I mean, if you had a situation where, after long consideration, your experts simply split 50-50. This sounds like politics, but it's art history. Should you then invite the owner to make a decision about whether or not they would like the work published as a maybe, or would they rather have it not published? How does that sound as etiquette? Of course, you have to divulge that in some sort of an introduction, that those are the rules of your game. But it's true, David. If you get the letter that says we're not going to include it, fine. But if you get the letter that says we can't decide whether or not we're going to include it, then what's the next step from that?
I think it would be even more confusing, though, David, if the committee would change its mind. So at one point, yes, it is a Rembrandt, and then now it isn't a Rembrandt, and then maybe it's back and forth. And I should think that that would be most confusing, and that it might be easier just to say, wait, we don't know. Nobody likes to wait. However, I find that waiting very often solves problems.
My experience is the contrary.
Really?
People who have dubious Cézannes, or works that we deem to be dubious, they seem to come back generation after generation. I mean, I've seen the same picture come back so many times, even though we've made it clear that it's not going to be in the Catalogue Raisonné.
Do we have the microphone? You did this. All these people. There's lots of hands up front. Oh, you've got it.
Hi, I've
Hi,
got
Jen.
it. So I'm Jennifer Mass from Scientific Analysis of Fine Art, and I'd like to say that I think that some of the major connoisseurship, and in fact, most of the major connoisseurship discoveries in the last generation have actually not been made in visible light, but they've been made through infrared examination of paintings. And I'm talking about, for example, the Cézanne collection at the Barnes Foundation, that moment when you're confronted with genius, when a painting just brings you to your knees. That often happens in the infrared examination of the painting, where we see, for example, paintings that are signed by Cézanne, not in the paint layer, but in the drawing. And I feel like a lot of this information that's collected by conservators is not getting to scholars and is not getting to art historians. And so often what we see is ignorance, I think, of art historical scholarship from conservators and ignorance of the conservation scholarship from the art historians. And so when we talk about a balance, when we talk about a middle ground, I think what we're really thinking about is, shouldn't there be a conservator on these Catalogue Raisonné committees so that we can examine these paintings in really the most effective possible way, which is using the entire electromagnetic spectrum and not using the same visible light approach that we've been using 100 years ago or 200 years ago.
It's great. It seems to me that that's where we're going. I mean, it's not just conservation information, it's a lot of different kinds of data which until now really haven't been collected. And because they haven't been collected, it's often impossible to access it. I read that actually the Dutch government was beginning to create a data bank of conservation information pertaining to Rembrandt school works that would be available online to anyone. Is that correct? But I don't know that. I mean, I don't know that any of the groups that do catalogs have the resources, the financial resources or the resources of time to take advantage of that moment that you would have at the Barnes collection when you were able to see something under an infrared light, unfortunately. But we still have this body of literature that's been created, without that.
If I could just add a couple of, one practical point and one sort of wishful point. And those are all points well taken, Jennifer. And I think that should such technical analysis be done, and I actually think this should be done with all data acquisition of whatever sort, even if it's just looking with one's eyes, the conditions under which the data is taken and the instrumentation, all possible variables should be documented so that when other data comes, the comparability of the data can be assessed. Are they even comparable? You might actually be comparing sort of semi-apples to apples. And that's, so I think that's just a procedural way of going about it, the way the scientists like Jennifer do. They document how they do all of this. Now, my wishful question comes to, well, how does one become a scholar on a Catalogue Raisonné? It seems to me that you're an art historian who takes an interest and sort of learns as you go along these things that, at least these technical things and the process of connoisseurship. Is there a little more training in this area that might be made available in the perfect future?
I certainly think that museums are the best place to have this training, because there you're working with the collection, with the body of works. However, most museums are reluctant to take on Catalogue Raisonné projects because they're all afraid of being sued. And so that there is a liability. I mean, I know that's not the subject of this panel, but I do think that museums are the place because you have a conservation department, you also have contact with a variety of technical experts, you have people who are used to looking at objects and working with objects. Do you agree, Stephanie?
I think it could be certainly a place.
Yeah.
But I also think that we need more people in the museum to do that effectively. and get everything else done that we do. But yes, I think it would be a great place. I was saying before, I think the best exhibitions are ones that marry archival and
Yes.
conservation research together already, so that it does happen.
Exactly.
I have a question about the degree to which the means and methods of arriving at decisions of what's in or what's out or what's maybe. Catalogue Raisonnés over the last few decades have gotten much better, I think, about having user guides and essays on means and methods. But rarely do they go into much explanation of what the process is for reviewing a work of art and trying to formulate a conclusion. And my question is, do you think that it's possible or advisable to try to explain a little bit more of that mystery so that not only the general public might have a greater confidence, but also, frankly, scholars who are referring to the books and aren't always sure why something that may look anomalous actually was reviewed by a committee and accepted as authentic?
Well, I actually, speaking on behalf of several of the Catalogue Raisonnés that we're working on currently, we're hoping with our research to show exactly why we came to our positive decisions by turning over all of the cataloging data, the exhibition history, the archival information that we're keeping. We would like to make that known. It becomes a little bit different when we have a work that we're outright rejecting. We don't give reasons for our rejections, but we do have an open dialogue with applicants who've submitted works to us where it is unclear. We don't necessarily have a written correspondence, but we do tell them, this is pending, and we'll tell them why it's pending, and what more we would need. And sometimes they can provide that to us. We need more provenance. We need a letter from the owner in the 1950s who said that they bought it from a dealer. We need to gather more information, and we'll be very forthright about that. And I think that's how Catalogue Raisonnés are proceeding now. It's not so opaque. It's very much about showing the reasoning behind your yes decisions more than it ever was before.
I'm doing a Catalogue Raisonné on the works of Eastman Johnson, and I'm actually planning to write little essays as to why I think there are a lot of different categories of pictures that he did, genre and portraits and drawings, and have little essays that would help guide people and give them a general idea as to why it is that I think he's such a wonderful painter. But my question was another one about the maybes. And there were two instances, and I've been looking at Eastman Johnson for 40 years. One was at Sotheby's, and another was at the Art Institute of Chicago. And in both of them, I said, maybe at one time this was an Eastman Johnson, but the restoration has been so heavy that it's no longer, to me, an Eastman Johnson. And if you all could comment on that. So even today, my assistant and I were talking about this, and I said I'd raise this, because she said, what do we do this? Should we put this in, because we have a category of requires further study. And we're always wondering, should we put that in or put it out? And now from the panel, it seems that very clearly to me, I should keep these things in that have been traditionally assigned. Either they've been in a museum for, 80 years and they've said it, or something like that. But the question of the heavily restored works, what do you do with those?
I'm guessing that's a question for me. I will, first of all, get hot under the collar, because I really don't like it when we're told pictures have been ruined by restorers. We are social animals. We operate within a sphere, just like art historians do, just like all of the uncertainty that we're talking about here occurs. Granted, we're monkeying with the goods when we are when we're doing our work, but I think that a work that has been ruined and needs to be removed from an artist's oeuvre, I think that the question may still very much be open. Who's to say that that restoration, to some degree, can't be reversed? And if you know what an Eastman Johnson is supposed to be, perhaps that would be a helpful thing to let the next conservator know. But I also think, back to my earlier observation, this work is traveling through history, and a restoration is an interpretation of it as well. It's not a scientific fact. We try to bring as much science to bear and as much objectivity to bear, but in the end, it travels through history, and the conservator is a moment in their time. So that restoration, too, ought to be well documented and part of the record that goes forward as to what was once thought to be the authentic look of an Eastman Johnson.
I would agree. From my experience at other institutions, besides the one I'm at now, there have been times when something, doing work on it, we realized it didn't look the way it once looked before. And certainly didn't put it up in the gallery because it was not the best reflection of that artist. And maybe a false impression of that artist, but it wasn't something that I would ever consider not having as a part of the collection, demoting it to, a study object, because it's still a historical record of that artist. It's been changed in some way, and I guess the parallel in a Catalogue Raisonné would be potentially to still have it as a record, not to take it away, because that's actually changing history. But some other kind of category to acknowledge that this work may not look the way it did when it left the artist's studio, but it certainly shouldn't disappear from history. It was in an exhibition, it was published at one time, the artist still made it, and to take it away seems to actually be more dramatic than acknowledging a change.
Yep.
Agree. Thank you first of all for being here and sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. I had a thought and I have a question. My first thought was listening to the issues of liability and the possibility of expressing some kind of doubt that scholars would like to include in these catalogue raisonnés. Is it maybe time to let go of the term catalogue raisonné and change it to some type of database, like the Rembrandt database or research project? So that was one thought. And the other thing was a question for those people that are involved in catalogue raisonnés. We've talked about the maybes, the 50-50 decision. What do you do if the decision of the committee is 60-40, so 60 positive, 40 very negative? Would you still include that work, or will you go on reasoning until it improves, the odds improve? What do you do in a situation like that?
You can add to the committee.
I think that's what, yeah.
I mean, would you be satisfied if there are less people on your committee, but let's say the example, there are 10 people, 6 are in favor, 4 are against. What do you do in that case? Because obviously it's somewhat doubtful. Do you still let that stand as the majority has chosen and you will include that work? What do you do with that?
But often a catalogue raisonné has just one author. And I think that somebody has to take responsibility. And very often it's one person, it's one scholar, or it's one person who has done research and studied the artist for most of her or his life. It's not always a committee job.
Right.
For our project, there are 3 of us, and of course we have the background of John Rewald and the background of before him of Leonardo Venturi. if the three of us can't agree on something, we stick with Rewald's opinion. We recognize this is a collaborative effort, so I'm perfectly happy to ask other people whose opinions I respect what they think about a certain situation. So when I say add to the committee, what I really meant was make it into a more collaborative effort.
It's nice that you keep John Rewald on the committee too.
I can say at the Wildenstein Plattner Institute, we have taken the stance that the committee decisions need to be unanimous. Very much like a trial by jury. They need to be unanimous. If there is a holdout, that holdout needs to be convinced. Because we're working with our archives. We're working with our archives and we're working with connoisseurship. And we're basing our decisions on what we see in front of us when we're physically examining a work. And if there's one person who just has a doubt, we really want to take that doubt into consideration and explore it. So we don't have that 60-40 issue. If we had a 9D10 issue, we would still hold back until everyone was satisfied with the decision. And it doesn't come up that often, I have to say. There aren't that many maybes that we're seeing. Most of them are pretty clear that they're either no or yes.
We'd be whittled down to quite a few works. I mean, there wouldn't be very many works left if our committee were only to include unanimous opinions. And of course, these were vigorously discussed among people, all of them with equivalent backgrounds and expertise in the field, but all of them operating in a situation where the documentation was so thin that that you had to rely greatly on connoisseurship and on intuition. So far, we're at a situation where we write, it's our current intention to include if we can get a majority opinion rather than a unanimous opinion. And we've often wondered, in a publication, if that's the case, and you would explain that, of course, in the introduction, that's how things were either in or not in the book. Was it our responsibility ethically to indicate those cases where it wasn't unanimous? Would you have 4 stars for something that was unanimous and 3 for something that was less so, and so on, so the reader would know there was such a difference of opinion. But we don't have an answer.
Do you examine all the works in the original with the committee?
Yes.
And with
Yes.
also with comparable works?
Whenever we can, yes. I mean, we're right across the street from the Museum of Modern Art,
Yeah.
which is formidable holdings there.
I have a question regarding it goes back to the ethics of scholarship embedded in Catalogue Raisonné, but I would like to kind of move it a little forward in terms of generations. For the most part, it's been discussed, and I believe the generation of the 50s, in that it's paintings and drawings. And in looking to the future of Catalogue Raisonné, and when the time comes to begin working in full with the generation that came of age in the 60s and has either continued to work to the present day or passed away in the last decade, in which part of the nature of the work was to shift its nature, the repetition of a single element in different artworks, the change of titles, the malleability of information that was embedded in artist practices, somehow makes the job of certainty and the Catalogue Raisonné that much more difficult, because it's very much at the core of the artist's practice and the generation itself. So my question to you all is, how do you see the future of Catalogue Raisonné in terms of the ethics that are in place transitioning to address the issues of future generations of artists?
Well, we're hopeful that that the online format speaks to the future, because it can be modified. as more information comes along. I mean, one of the reasons why I think maybes is a different question today than it was 20 years ago is that we now have a technology that allows us to modify and update a publication rather than constantly having new catalog raisonnés. I think when this began, I mean, in the case of someone like Manet, for example, there would be a new one every 10 years, and you would wonder why. And I think that's still fairly prevalent in cases like Modigliani and whatnot, where it just seems as if there are competing groups of catalogers who have different opinions about the corpus.
Right.
So, yeah, I mean, the future is going to have more information, presumably, than we have, and be able to make decisions that we couldn't make.
Well, I think just also to bring it back to Leslie's question about, is a catalogue raisonné, should it be called a catalogue raisonné? Does our conception of a catalogue raisonné need to change? And I'm of the mindset that it does, particularly with digital publication, because it is so mutable. A catalogue raisonné is out of date the moment that it's printed. So the idea is not to print them. It's to continually update them and make them dynamic and make them robust and make them interactive. And I think with, to bring it back to your question about artists whose works are also mutable, I think the online format is the only way to address that, and to document just the facts that they change, and go through transformations over time, just as a digital platform would. You document the news as it's happening. So I don't know if that answers it, but that's how I see it. I just see that the world of print catalogue raisonnés is really at a point where it's going to have to change, and our conception of what is a catalogue raisonné also needs to change.
And just to state the obvious here, but digital security and hacking becomes, I mean, you really have to up your game to a really high level to avoid that. Yeah.
What occurs to me is that we've been talking about catalogues raisonnés as if they were a generic category, whereas I think that that's false. Each catalogue raisonné really is different depending upon the artist. And so that you really have to do your research, you have to compile your data, depending upon the person that you're studying. And certainly a catalogue raisonné of Sol LeWitt is going to be very, very different from Tanguy. And that you have to adapt for new generations and new media, for James Turrell or for all the artists who haven't even gotten to the stage of compiling all their work. So that you really have to structure your research, your final product, depending upon the artist that you're working on.
I wanted to use a backdrop of what seems to me how culture and societies are demanding more transparency. And with that as a backdrop, I wonder, using a practical example of the Mayer Gallery versus the Agnes Martin Catalogue Raisonné, and without talking about the specific individuals, what really seemed smart to me actually on Artifacts' behalf was they had managed to make a contract in which, according to the judge who made the ruling, where they don't have to actually specify why or why not they were going to include any of these works that had a provenance dealing with Mayer Gallery. Now, as a person from the public realm, it seems really kind of difficult because, again, I don't want anyone to have to talk about individuals, but you would think that because of the reputations involved, that both sides probably have some source of knowledge and they did some sort of vetting, right? But then you're stuck in this kind of catch-22 where, because the litigation concerns, it's smarter to have a contract with someone who's submitting their work for a raisonné, inclusion, where there's no reason having to be given. And so then when you're from an audience perspective or in the public realm, you don't know how those decisions are actually made. And because they're not going to reveal that, because then they can open themselves up to greater litigation. So it draws me back to this backdrop of like, well, everyone seems to be clamoring for this greater sense of transparency to break down things that are once seen as so monolithic. But where is the negotiating room for people who are developing raisonnés? I wonder if anyone has a comment on that.
Yeah, that's a sticky wicket. One would think that simply airing the reasons for and against these works would be the correct way to go about it. I mean, to share the doubts. It seems to me that the more you can describe why it's maybe, the better off you are.
It just seems to me that examples from litigation are never going to get us very far. The subtleties of scholarship are largely lost on the courts, I think.
Yeah.
Yes?
Thank you very much. I have a question at the beginning. Mr. Stuckey, you said that one of the maybes, that one of the kinds of maybes there were uncharacteristic works.
Yes.
And I wanted to ask, anyone on the panel or whoever wants to answer, what do you do with uncharacteristic works when what's really at issue is what's characteristic to the artist? Like the Warhol example that's on the flyer, where it was really a debate about Warhol works this way, Warhol doesn't work this way. So how do you handle those things where really it's like the author function and the sort of spirit of the artist are really the issue?
Well, in the case of the that you bring up, the Warhol, there is now a rogue catalog addressing just those questions, and it was a sort of a catalog of the Warhol maybes that is online with Richard Polsky, and I assume that if left to its own devices, I mean, if there is no consensus from organizations like the CRSA, that the market will create more and more mechanisms to insert themselves into the areas of uncertainty, and they'll take it upon themselves. I mean, by ignoring the questions, those people involved with Catalogue Raisonnés are allowing other people to address them. I mean, there's no way about that. Do we have a microphone for John? Well,
I came in late, but I was wondering if you addressed the matter of financial liability, and which comes up constantly for those of us who are not scholars but dealers. And you absolutely can't give your opinion, no matter what. I mean, you may have a lot of knowledge, but you can't do anything with it. And the panel could perhaps fight this. It's in the courts to protect us, and you have the advantage of more knowledge. You know what I'm talking about? I mean, we can be sued at the drop of a hat.
So can we.
Yes, but I mean, if you can't be sued and we can't be sued, it would be a help to everybody.
That's another panel.
Exactly.
But there actually can be practical solutions to that. I believe that over a period of years now, legislation has been introduced in Albany. It's never passed, to my knowledge, but that would at least begin to address this liability question.
But if we do it as dealers, it looks self-serving, whereas if you do it as scholars, it's for the interest of your Catalogue Raisonné or whatever. It's really agonizing. You go all over the place, and not, without saying no.
It is, well.
You can't say this is wrong.
Exactly, and we say it's our current intention not to include it.
But it's
I mean, we've developed a form of language to express that without expressing it, for legal
Oh,
reasons.
yes.
Yeah,
we could say it's not of interest,
Yes,
there you go.
yeah.
but that means it goes on someplace else, from someplace else.
Absolutely. I think that's the point we were just making
Yeah.
with what happens to certain kinds of undecideds is that you know one's walking away from them,
You suggest a
but somebody
country
else won't.
auction.
Yeah.
Well, they keep coming up, that's the problem.
Right.
And unless we can stop that, suddenly it's in East Hampton, and then it's in Ohio, and then, I think working in an auction gallery, you get more training than any place, because it's stuff coming in constantly. Don't you think?
The excuse used to be, sorry, we can't accept it for sale because we cannot guarantee its authenticity. You're not saying no.
Very good.
Maybe David has some more recent information.
One thing I'd say, David, in our old days, we might think it's right, but not have an affirmation from an expert, so we couldn't sell it. But we would also sometimes have I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confused here. You know, I lost track of my thought, sorry. If we would do some kind of inverse, the expert would say it's right, and through our experience back then, when we saw so much, we try to slip out of it like it's not really the right moment in the market.
Yeah.
When we doubted the
Yeah.
specialists, but that was not today.
Or you can always say it doesn't fit into our sale.
This has been very informative. There's a question I think that you said you'd get back to, and that is a question of provenance. I look at the provenance even from Sotheby's and Christie's, and I think, I don't know if this is right or not. And how do you, it is important to have provenance, but what about provenance that you yourself cannot guarantee? Because usually the auction houses will not tell you, all the information you want to know, or a dealer won't. So what do? Do you just write it down and say we can't be responsible for it, or,
I think the job of a catalogue raisonné is at least in the United States, we're not saying that something is or is not authentic. It's based on our research. We've decided to include it, and that has to do with provenance as well. And what, at least speaking for the projects that I'm working with, when we have evidence of the provenance, we're going to share that. I think that's very important. I don't think that whenever I see a line of provenance, I'll always question, well, where did that come from? And I think that's increasingly what scholars who are working on catalogue raise are doing. We're not just accepting it as fact because it was printed in another book. We're actually looking to see, well, why was that printed in another book? So I do think there's a level of due diligence now in catalogue raisonné research that there wasn't in the past. Any more questions?
There's a gentleman over here.
So, building on Ursula's question, what advice would you give a contemporary artist to avoid any maybes?
Document your work. Document your work.
Document your work.
In what form would that documentation be?
I think you should work with someone. If it's not the artist themselves, the artist needs a registrar working with them at all times, photographing their work, digital. Not that I don't have faith
account,
in
maybe.
Whatever it might be. I found that now, certainly with Gerhard Richter, who is meticulous and has an entire army documenting what he's doing. It is so important. A lot of artists oftentimes don't know what's going to don't know what happens to their work as soon as it leaves their studio. And I think that it's very important, because you lose that control as it leaves your studio, to make sure you've documented it while it's there and don't take it for granted. Oftentimes, the artists that I've spoken to don't think about their legacy, and they don't think about what's going to happen after the story is not theirs to tell. So claim that story for yourself and take ownership of it while it's in your control.
And also protect that information. Don't keep it in your studio. Put it someplace else so that it doesn't get lost or yeah.
I think it's time to wrap it up. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.